IBESS, Intro to Resources, Part 5, will focus on environmental impact assessments. The significant ideas are: sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Environmental impact assessments play an important role in sustainable development. Here is the outline of all the available movies for the Intro to Resources unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. Here is the first IB syllabus statement. Define environmental impact assessment, EIA. An EIA is a process for identifying the environmental effects, positive and negative, of proposed developments before development consent is granted. By what process would society decide to build a resort here? EIAs work to predict the environmental effects of the proposed development. By what process would society decide to build a road here? One criterion would be to conduct a baseline study to provide information against which one could monitor and assess the development's progress and effectiveness during implementation and after the development is completed. Environmental impact assessments identify the environmental effects before development consent is granted. EIAs incorporate baseline studies before a development project is undertaken. By what process would society decide to transform this swamp into a housing project? EIAs provide decision makers with information in order to consider the environmental impact of a project. EIAs evaluate possible impacts and suggest mitigation strategies for the project. By what process would society decide to develop a mine here? Environmental impact assessments incorporate baseline studies before a development project is undertaken. What species are here? What's the diversity of the location? An environmental impact assessment is a process for identifying the environmental effects of proposed developments before development consent is granted. Were baseline studies completed before this housing project went in? Was an EIA involved so that decision makers could predict the environmental impact of this development? Did the EIA suggest mitigating strategies? By what process would society decide to develop a ski resort here? Environmental impact assessments assess the environmental, social, and economic impacts of development. EIAs provide decision makers with information in order to consider the environmental impact of the development project. In order to consider the environmental impact of the development project, baseline studies need to be completed before the project is underway so that we can better understand the impact of the project once it's in motion. So here are the IB syllabus statements that drive this movie forward. Environmental impact assessments assess the environmental, social, and economic impacts of a development project, predicting and evaluating possible impacts, and suggesting mitigation strategies for the project. And by the end of this movie, you need to be able to evaluate the use of EIAs. The environmental impact assessment is a process for identifying the environmental effects of proposed developments before development consent is granted. Should a nuclear power facility be built here? The aim of an EIA is to prevent, reduce, or mitigate the significant adverse environmental effects of development proposals and enhance positive ones. By what process would society decide to develop a golf course here? EIAs provide decision makers with information in order to consider the environmental impact of the project. By what process would society decide to build a dam on this river? The aim of an EIA is to prevent, reduce, or offset the significant adverse environmental effects of development proposals and enhance positive effects. By what process would society decide to develop shrimp farms in this coastal location? The EIA is a means to ensure that planning decisions are made in the knowledge of the attendant environmental effects. The EIA process enables environmental factors to be given due weight along with economic and social factors when development applications are being considered, and the responsibilities fall on the developer who collects data, undertakes consultations and environmental studies, and plans mitigation. Responsibility also falls on the local planning authority who reviews the EIA and makes the decision. The stakeholders in development projects are the developer, the local planning authority, government, and people, the needs of the people, important needs and sometimes less important needs. Keep in mind that the environment cannot speak for itself. The first step in an EIA is site selection. Not every site is equal. Consider the environmental impacts in the specific site that's chosen. So in order to do that, you would carry out a preliminary walkover where you identify important potential issues such as water availability, potential pollution, erosion, and what species might be impacted. Environmental impact assessments incorporate baseline studies before a development project is undertaken. Baseline studies allow EIAs to assess the environmental impacts of the project. EIAs are followed by an audit and continued monitoring. Each country or region has different guidance on the use of EIAs. An EIA requires that there be a baseline study that determines the suitability of the site. You document what species are there, the diversity of the site, so that change can be monitored. The baseline study provides information against which one can monitor and assess the development's progress and effectiveness during implementation, and effectiveness after the development is completed. The ability to assess changes to biodiversity in a given community over time is important in assessing the impact of human activity in the community. So let me digress with a review of the quantification of ecological diversity. So which of these two communities is more diverse? Diversity is a function of the number of different species and a function of their relative abundance. Hopefully you can see that this community is likely to be more diverse because it has more different species than this community. So if you have 5 species, like location 2, as compared to only 4, like location 1, the diversity is higher in location 2. But relative abundance is important as well, because site 4 with 5 species is a site where 1 species is dominant in terms of abundance. Compare site 4 with site 2. Both have 5 species, but site 4 is much less diverse because the relative abundance of the 5 species is not evenly distributed. This data table provides the abundance, counts of individuals of different species in 3 locations. You can see site X is the most diverse because it has the most species by far. But site Y and Z each have 7 species, and each site is dominated by 1. But site Z is slightly more diverse because the relative abundance is more evenly distributed, with the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th species represented in hundreds, which is not the case with site Y. Remember that the quantification of biodiversity is important to conservation efforts so that areas of high biodiversity may be identified, explored, and appropriate conservation put in place where possible. Numerical values of diversity are useful to understanding the nature of biological communities and, in turn, important in the conservation of biodiversity. So having completed the site selection, site walkover, and baseline study, the next phase is design. The project design should respond to environmental constraints. The design should adjust, change, and show innovation. EIAs aim to predict and evaluate possible impacts, and EIAs suggest mitigation strategies. The design needs to be innovative to mitigate the negative effects of the development. EIAs include mitigation strategies. There would be avoidance, to avoid adverse effects on the environment. There would be the reduction, to reduce adverse effects on the environment. There would be compensation, to provide compensation in the case of harm. And there would be remediation. This would be management measures to limit the influence of harm or cleanup afterwards. The mitigation strategies could include enhancement to make opportunities to have positive effects through innovative design. You write up a mitigation report in advance of the development, and consultants are hired. Consultants provide information on studies done on comparable projects completed elsewhere. These are called comparables. And consultants could include experts on water flow, engineering, design features, traffic patterns, etc. As part of the EIA process, the developer might consult with interested parties, stakeholders, inform and educate the public, NGOs. As well, there would be monitoring of the environment before the development and after. And by monitor, I mean to gather data on change, both the abiotic and the biotic. After having been in this course, ESS, for a year and a half, can you describe methods for gathering this data? The IB ESS syllabus includes sampling strategies may be used to measure biotic and abiotic factors and their change over time before and after a human impact as part of an EIA. Use quadrats, many quadrats, to increase accuracy. Randomly select quadrat placement. Measure the number of individuals or percent cover or dry mass. Calculate Simpson's diversity index. Many quadrats must be sampled so that averages can be calculated. And take the data, the means, and multiply up to determine the diversity of the larger area. The EIA process would include continued coordination with environmental professionals who carry out further surveys on air quality, water quality, soil quality, the visual impact, archaeological impact, traffic surveys, noise surveys, or even light surveys. The EIA process includes continued coordination with environmental professionals who carry out further scientific surveys on air, water, soil, the visual impact, the archaeological impact, traffic, noise, light. Criticisms of EIAs include a lack of standard practice from region to region, a lack of training for the practitioners of the development project, lack of clear definition of system boundaries, and a lack of inclusion of indirect impacts. Now, these criticisms are IB syllabus stated criticisms, and this is the last time that I'm presenting them. At this point, you should be able to evaluate the use of EIAs. Remember that environmental impact assessments provide decision makers with information in order to consider the environmental impact of a project. Many socioeconomic factors influence the implementation of EIAs. And that brings us to the end of IB ESS Introduction to Resources, Part 5.